What if the gods you've never heard of, gods with African roots, were the original deities worshipped before Yahweh? What if history deliberately erased their names, their power, and their presence from the story we've been told? Are you ready to discover the truth that's been hidden for millennia? Before the rise of Yahweh in the Bible, ancient African civilizations worshipped powerful black gods central to their spiritual and cultural lives. Today, we'll uncover the secret religion that was erased, gods who were gods of wisdom, creation, and rebirth. The question is, why were they erased from history? Let's dive into the forgotten gods of Africa and their profound influence on early spirituality. We'll explore deities like Osiris, Amun-Ra, and Isis, gods with African features who shaped the spiritual landscape long before Yahweh became the central figure. It's a story of erasure and rediscovery, and how their legacy still echoes in today's world and in your own life. 1. The ancient black gods of Africa. The ancient civilizations of Africa, long before the name Yahweh ever resounded through the lands of Israel, were already deeply immersed in a rich tapestry of spiritual beliefs. These cultures revered gods who weren't just figures in the sky or abstract forces. They were embodiments of nature, life, and death, personified with African features. Central to these beliefs were deities like Osiris, Amun-Ra, and Isis, whose power governed everything from creation to resurrection, from wisdom to justice. In ancient Egypt, Osiris stood as the god of resurrection, representing life, death, and rebirth in a seamless cycle that mirrored the nature of the world itself. His black skin was often depicted in art, symbolizing fertility, life's constant renewal, and the connection between human beings and the divine. His story wasn't just a myth. It was an essential spiritual practice for understanding the afterlife and divine justice. This was a god who ruled over the cosmic cycle, intricately intertwined with the rhythm of nature. Amun-Ra, the sun god, was another vital figure in ancient African spirituality. Amun-Ra wasn't merely a god of the heavens. He was the very breath of life that moved through all of creation. His image was also represented as dark-skinned, signifying his presence in the world of men and the cosmos. He was not only a creator god, but a god who sustained the earth, directly linking his divinity to the land and the people. And then there was Isis, the mother goddess, goddess of fertility, motherhood, and magic. She was considered one of the most powerful figures in Egyptian mythology, known for her wisdom and her protective nature over her people. Isis was often depicted as a black woman, radiating power and grace, her influence extending over the realms of life and death. She is seen as a symbol of nurturing, healing, and spiritual strength. These gods were not abstract beings. They were embedded in the lives of the people, manifesting in the cycles of nature, the rhythms of daily life, and the cycles of birth and death. The spirituality of the people wasn't compartmentalized into a single domain. It flowed through every part of existence. Worship and spirituality were inseparable from the very act of living. Whether it was planting crops, celebrating the harvest, or remembering the dead, the divine was everywhere, in everything. Recognizing the sacred in nature, in the seasons, in the death and rebirth cycles, this is a lesson that these ancient gods left behind. They show us that spirituality isn't bound by the walls of temples or religious dogma. It's found in the soil beneath our feet, in the stars above, and in the hearts of those we love. By reconnecting to these African gods, we don't just recover lost deities. We reclaim a spirituality that was deeply rooted in the earth itself. It's a reminder that the divine isn't distant. It's in us, around us, and always present, if we choose to see it. 2. The rise of Yahweh and the erasure of black gods. As history moved forward, the rise of Yahweh as the singular God of the Israelites marked a significant shift in spiritual traditions, one that would have lasting consequences for the entire world. The Hebrews, settling in Canaan, found themselves in a land filled with peoples whose spiritual beliefs were deeply intertwined with African traditions. These people worshipped gods who were powerful, who had shape, form, and divine influence, gods like those of Egypt, Canaan, and other African civilizations. But the rise of Yahweh, the God of Israel, brought a tectonic shift to the religious landscape. Yahweh, in his early portrayal, was not just a god, he was the God. With Yahweh came the transition from a polytheistic worldview to one of strict monotheism. This was a move not just theologically, but politically and culturally. As the Israelites began to establish themselves as a unified people, the worship of other gods became incompatible with the growing power of Yahweh, and thus the divine powers that once shaped and influenced the ancient world were systematically erased from history. In the Hebrew Bible, there are many references to gods worshipped by neighboring peoples, gods like Baal, Asherah, and Molech. But these gods were always framed as false idols, as temptations that led Israel astray. The Bible mentions them, but rarely delves into the deep, spiritual significance of these deities, or the long-standing traditions from which they emerged. The narrative is clear. Worship these gods, and you are disobedient. Defy Yahweh, and you risk his wrath. This demonization and erasure were not just spiritual acts, they were strategic. The shift from a diverse and vibrant spiritual world to a single monotheistic Yahweh was as much about consolidating power as it was about theology. By erasing the gods of the surrounding cultures, particularly those of African origin, Yahweh became the only deity in the eyes of the Israelites. This wasn't simply an act of faith, it was an act of control, the construction of a new religious identity that needed to be set apart from the past, to declare that Yahweh was the only God worth following. This erasure was not merely a theological one. It affected the way people viewed their own spiritual practices, their traditions, and their connections to their ancestry. The gods of the Africans, who had once represented profound connections to nature, life, and death, were now pushed to the margins. Worship of these deities became synonymous with sin, idolatry, and paganism. These were no longer the sacred figures of creation and justice, but false gods to be forgotten, their sacred names erased from the collective memory. But the question remains: why erase them? Why was it so important to silence the memory of these black gods? The answer lies in the power dynamics of religion and politics. By eliminating the spiritual autonomy of other peoples, Yahweh's exclusive reign became a tool to unite a people, to create a collective identity rooted in obedience to one God. And in doing so, the richness of spiritual diversity, the legacy of African gods who shaped the cosmos, was lost to time. This part of history serves as a reminder to reflect on the spiritual diversity that once existed and the cost of its erasure. It's not only about looking back at these ancient deities, but about asking ourselves how we view the divine today. Do we embrace the spiritual diversity around us, or do we hold on to rigid doctrines that erase the beauty and wisdom of the past? How does this tension between autonomy and religious control affect our faith today? 3. The spiritual colonization of the divine. As the rise of Yahweh became dominant, it wasn't simply about the establishment of one God over another. It was about spiritual colonization, the deliberate act of removing, replacing, and redefining how the divine was understood. The shift toward Yahweh's exclusive worship wasn't just a matter of religious preference, but one of power and control over people's faith, identities, and spiritual autonomy. And it wasn't just about eliminating deities, it was about creating a new narrative, one that erased all remnants of a vibrant, diverse spiritual history that had once connected people to the divine in deeply personal and powerful ways. The Bible, especially in the early texts, speaks of prohibitions against creating images of the divine or worshipping gods that are not Yahweh. Exodus 20:4-5 declares, "You shall not make for yourselves a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above or on the earth below." This commandment speaks not only to the prohibition of idolatry, but also to the profound transformation of how people interacted with the divine. It was not just a theological shift. It was a systematic attempt to remove the connection between the divine and the physical world, to eliminate any tangible representations of godly power. In the African and African-influenced civilizations, the divine was often represented in the earth, in the elements, and through physical forms. Gods like Osiris and Amun-Ra had clear forms that connected people to the earth, the sky, and the cycles of life. The physical world was not separate from the spiritual world. It was a reflection of it. In contrast, the shift toward a god like Yahweh represented a break from this connection. The need to establish Yahweh as the exclusive deity meant disconnecting people from the natural world and, by extension, their deeper, more intuitive spiritual practices. The act of colonizing the divine was not only about removing African gods from the narrative, but also about severing the connection between the people and their sacred traditions. The ancient rituals that were once celebrated openly, rituals that honored nature, the ancestors, and the cycles of life and death, became labeled as pagan or sinful. The spiritual autonomy of African peoples was systematically suppressed. What was once revered as sacred was now seen as dangerous. Practices that allowed people to connect with the divine in the elements, through music, dance, and rituals, were stripped away, replaced by rigid, centralized forms of worship that demanded submission to a single god. But what's at stake here is more than just religious practice. By erasing these ancient spiritual connections, the spiritual memory of an entire people was damaged. Generations grew up without a connection to the sacred aspects of their lives, without the deep understanding of their own spiritual roots. The impact of this erasure was profound, disconnecting individuals from a living, pulsating spirituality that was both personal and communal. The spiritual colonization of the divine isn't a historical event of the past alone. It continues to affect us today. It is a reminder of how easily religions and religious authorities can shape people's understanding of the divine to suit their own power dynamics. It reminds us of the importance of reconnecting with the deeper truths of our spiritual identities, truths that lie buried beneath centuries of suppression, forgotten rituals, and distorted teachings. Reclaiming the sacred knowledge of our ancestors is not just a spiritual task, it is an act of liberation. Reconnecting with the sacred in the world around us, just as our African ancestors did, is a way to restore the balance that was lost. We are invited to consider how we approach spirituality today. Do we continue to adhere to narrow, exclusive views, or do we embrace the expansive, diverse ways in which the divine can manifest in our world? The spiritual journey of reconnection is not just about returning to the past. It is about reclaiming the fullness of our spiritual potential and connecting with the divine in ways that empower, liberate, and heal. 4. The impact of the whitewashing of God. For centuries, the image of God has been predominantly portrayed as a white European figure, light skin, blue or green eyes, and straight hair. This portrayal of the divine has not only shaped people's understanding of who God is, but also reinforced cultural norms that associate holiness and perfection with a particular race. This whitewashed image of God has deeply influenced Christianity, shaping both theology and art, and has contributed to a profound spiritual disconnection for many, particularly those of African descent. The Bible, though, offers no explicit description of God's physical appearance. There is no indication that God was meant to reflect any one race. Yet over time, the depiction of God, especially in Christian art, has been heavily Europeanized. Artists such as Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, working under the patronage of powerful European churches, began creating images of a divine, white-skinned Christ. This artistic tradition spread across Europe and then to the rest of the world through missionary work and colonial expansion. The result was a widespread acceptance of a white European God who looked nothing like the people in Africa, the Middle East, or the broader biblical world. In the Christian tradition, this portrayal of a white God also coincided with the spread of European colonialism. The religion that was carried to Africa and the Americas was not just about faith. It was about power. The image of a white European god was used to justify the domination of non-European peoples, presenting a narrative that equated the divine with whiteness. This connection between race and divinity created a spiritual hierarchy that placed non-European cultures at the bottom. Black people, especially, were taught that their own skin color was a sign of spiritual inferiority. The message was clear: God was not of their image, and they were not worthy of his love unless they conformed to a European standard. The impact of this whitewashing of God has been profound. For many people of African descent, the image of God as a white figure created a sense of alienation from the divine. In the church, where people sought connection with God, they found that God looked nothing like them. The resulting internal conflict often led to feelings of inferiority, as people subconsciously equated whiteness with holiness and goodness. This spiritual colonization reinforced the idea that African culture, values, and spiritual practices were inferior or even sinful. However, there is a powerful truth that we must reclaim. God is not confined to any one race or ethnicity. The diversity of humanity reflects the diverse image of the divine. Black spirituality is just as valid and powerful as any other. When we acknowledge this truth, we open up a more inclusive and accurate understanding of God, one that celebrates the fullness of humanity, including African traditions that have been overlooked or erased. Reconnecting with a more holistic, inclusive understanding of the divine means rejecting the false notion that God can only be represented by a specific race. It means embracing a spirituality that reflects the sacred in all of us, regardless of our skin color. For those of African descent, reclaiming the images of God that reflect their own heritage is an act of healing. It restores dignity and spiritual identity to a people who have long been marginalized by dominant religious traditions. This process of reclaiming a fuller, more inclusive image of God begins with us. By recognizing that the divine does not belong to any one race or culture. God's image is vast, expansive, and multidimensional. It is time to embrace the diversity of the divine and allow all people to see themselves in the face of God. This is not just a theological correction. It is a spiritual liberation, freeing us from centuries of racial and religious domination. When we see God as he truly is, unlimited, boundless, and inclusive, we also see ourselves as we truly are, children of a divine creator who loves us all equally. 5. The role of Moses and African spiritual influences. Moses, the great leader of the Israelites, is one of the most pivotal figures in biblical history. But few recognize the deep connections he may have had with African spiritual traditions. Raised in Pharaoh's court, Moses was educated in one of the most powerful spiritual and intellectual centers of the ancient world, ancient Egypt. It is highly likely that Moses, like many leaders of the time, was exposed to the wisdom, teachings, and spiritual practices of African civilizations. The Egyptian culture was rich in spiritual knowledge, and many of its beliefs were deeply tied to the concepts of life, death, and divine law. These were themes that Moses would later incorporate into his leadership of the Israelites. The similarities between the spiritual practices of ancient Egypt and the early teachings of Moses are not coincidental. In fact, Moses' education in Pharaoh's court might have shaped the very foundation of Hebrew monotheism, blending ancient African wisdom with new revelations of the divine. In Exodus 3:14, God reveals himself to Moses saying, "I am who I am." This powerful statement marks the moment when Moses is called to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. But consider this, the declaration of God as "I am" is strikingly similar to the concept of the eternal, unchanging divine presence found in many African spiritual traditions. The ancient Egyptians, for example, understood the divine as omnipresent and eternal. They often spoke of the gods as beings who existed beyond the boundaries of time and space, much like the Hebrew understanding of God revealed to Moses. Furthermore, the symbolism of the burning bush, where Moses encounters God, mirrors spiritual practices found in many African traditions. In African spiritual thought, fire is often a symbol of transformation, purification and the presence of the divine. The burning bush that does not consume is a profound image of God's transcendence, a concept that echoes throughout African spiritual beliefs, where the divine can be present without being confined by material limits. The Exodus itself also holds strong parallels to African spiritual ideas, especially the concept of liberation. In Egypt, Moses' people were enslaved, oppressed, and marginalized, much like many African peoples were throughout history. Their journey through the desert and ultimate liberation is a reflection of the journey many oppressed peoples, including African nations, have undergone in their search for freedom, justice, and a return to their spiritual roots. As we delve deeper into Moses' story, we recognize that his leadership was not just shaped by divine revelation, but was also deeply influenced by his connection to African spirituality. Moses was raised in the heart of African civilization, and even though his faith would eventually lead him to proclaim Yahweh as the one true God, the spiritual wisdom he absorbed from Egyptian teachings undoubtedly shaped his understanding of divine law, justice, and liberation. For us today, understanding Moses' African spiritual roots invites us to reframe the narrative around his life and work. It challenges us to recognize the richness of African spiritual traditions and their contributions to the formation of monotheism. By acknowledging these influences, we can better appreciate the deep, interconnected roots of faith that stretch back thousands of years. This broader understanding invites us to embrace the diversity of God's revelation and celebrate the wisdom found in all spiritual traditions. 6. The legacy of African gods in the Bible. The Bible is often viewed as a clear narrative of the Israelites' journey with Yahweh. Yet, beneath its pages, there are echoes of spiritual legacies that predate the God of Israel. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Bible is the way it holds remnants of ancient African gods, gods whose influence shaped the very foundations of biblical spirituality. Take, for instance, the god Osiris, the Egyptian god of death and resurrection. Osiris' story of death and rebirth carries powerful symbolism, representing divine justice, eternal life, and the cyclical nature of existence. These themes have remarkable parallels in the story of Christ's death and resurrection. Just as Osiris is resurrected to bring life to the land, Jesus is resurrected to offer eternal life to humanity. The connection between Osiris' story and the New Testament's message of salvation isn't just coincidental. It speaks to a deeper, universal truth that transcends individual religious systems. Both figures represent hope in the face of death and the promise of spiritual renewal. Similarly, Amun-Ra, the sun god of Egypt, was worshipped as the creator and life force of the universe. In many ways, Amun-Ra embodies the divine principle of creation, wisdom, and power. His attributes resonate with the biblical portrayal of Yahweh as the creator God. In Genesis, we read that, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." The language of creation in both Egyptian spirituality and Hebrew scriptures reveals an intimate connection to the divine origin of life. Amun-Ra's role as the life-giver shares a deep similarity with the creation story in the Bible, suggesting a shared spiritual heritage that stretches beyond the boundaries of religion. The goddess Isis, revered as the protector of life and magic, represents the nurturing aspect of the divine. She was often depicted as a mother figure, one who cared for the sick, provided for the needy, and ensured the prosperity of the land. Her compassionate attributes can be found reflected in the biblical depiction of God's care for his people, especially through the figure of Mary, the mother of Jesus. Isis's nurturing nature prefigures the role of Mary as the mother of the Savior, bridging the maternal and protective aspects of the divine that are vital in both African and Christian spiritual traditions. Even the concept of divine justice, represented in African traditions by the goddess Maat, who upholds the balance of the universe, can be found in the Hebrew tradition. In the Bible, God is repeatedly portrayed as a judge who upholds justice, whether it's through the laws given to Moses or the ultimate judgment of humanity in Revelation. Ma'at's embodiment of cosmic order parallels the biblical concept of God's justice and the moral order that he demands from his people. By tracing these similarities, we uncover a fascinating intersection between African gods and the Hebrew tradition. The Bible's stories are not isolated from the vast spiritual landscape of the ancient world. Instead, they are part of a shared universal narrative of the divine. When we look at these connections, we are reminded that spiritual truth often transcends individual religious systems, and that the divine has manifested in myriad forms across cultures, shaping the hearts and minds of those who seek understanding. This revelation invites us to see the Bible not just as a singular narrative, but as one chapter in the broader story of human spirituality. It encourages us to recognize the deep spiritual ties between African traditions and the Hebrew scriptures, and to honor the wisdom that both cultures offer in their understanding of the divine. This reflection reminds us that God's truth is not confined to one tradition or culture, but is found throughout human history, across time, and in the hearts of all people who seek the divine. 7. Modern spiritual reawakening. In today's world, there is a growing movement to reconnect with the spiritual roots that have long been erased or forgotten. People are rediscovering the rich legacy of African spirituality, including the black gods that were once revered in ancient times. This reawakening is not just about remembering the past, but also about finding ways to integrate that wisdom into our lives today. As more people look for spiritual authenticity, many are turning to the ancient black gods as sources of inspiration. The resurgence of interest in African spirituality is a powerful reminder that these gods were not just relics of a distant past. They were living, vibrant forces that shaped the lives of entire civilizations. These spiritual practices were deeply connected to nature, the cosmos, and the cycles of life, death, and rebirth. And as we reclaim these practices, we find a profound sense of connection to the divine and to our ancestors. This reawakening isn't just about returning to old rituals or ancient gods. It's about acknowledging the spiritual richness that has always existed within our communities. It's about recognizing the deep wisdom in practices that have survived colonial erasure and centuries of suppression. By reconnecting with our roots, we also reconnect with the divine presence that was once so intimately tied to our identity. The gods of Africa were not distant or removed from humanity. They were part of the very fabric of daily life. They were present in the rhythms of the earth, the cycles of the seasons, and the lives of the people. What does this modern spiritual reawakening look like? It's about embracing the spirituality of our ancestors, whether it's through the power of song, dance, prayer, or ritual. It's about honoring the divine in nature, the earth, and our bodies, just as the ancient gods did. It's about rediscovering the sacredness of life and death, of family and community, of connection and belonging. It's a spirituality that doesn't require an institution to validate it, but is instead rooted in direct personal experience with the divine. This reawakening also challenges the spiritual monopolies that have historically excluded diverse voices and experiences. The story of the black gods and their legacy is one of resistance and survival. Survival not only through the literal erasure of their worship, but also through the transformation of these ancient deities into the very essence of spiritual identity. Their memory lives on in the hearts of those who refuse to forget. In today's world, we have the opportunity to reframe the narrative. We no longer need to accept a faith that alienates us from our heritage or spiritual roots. We can reclaim our connection to the divine as expressed through our cultural and ancestral practices. This journey of rediscovery is not just for the past, it's for the present and the future. By embracing our spiritual inheritance, we have the power to heal, transform, and awaken to a deeper understanding of who we are in the divine scheme of the universe. As we move forward in this journey, it is essential that we honor the legacy of these black gods, for they are not just pieces of ancient history, they are living, breathing symbols of power, strength, and spiritual resilience. The reawakening of this spirituality is a reclaiming of identity, a recognition of our divine worth, and a reminder that we are all interconnected in the vast, sacred web of creation. This is the power of spiritual awakening, the opportunity to reconnect with the divine in ways that are true to who we are and where we come from. Conclusion. As we reflect on the journey we've taken today, we see how the story of the black gods, once central to the spiritual practices of ancient African civilizations, has been systematically erased. The power and wisdom of deities like Osiris, Amun-Ra, and Isis were silenced by forces that sought to replace them with a singular, exclusive god. Yet, their legacy persists, hidden in plain sight, woven into the fabric of our spiritual DNA. This journey isn't just about uncovering the past. It's about rediscovering who we truly are, reconnecting to a spirituality that was once our birthright. When we look at the Bible, at the rise of Yahweh, and at the spiritual colonization that followed, we see a deeper narrative at play. The world was reshaped by a deliberate effort to erase the rich, diverse spiritual traditions of ancient African peoples. These black gods were more than mere mythological figures. They were symbols of resilience, of connection to the divine that transcended human institutions, and of autonomy in the face of spiritual oppression. The erasure of these gods was not only a religious shift, it was an act of cultural and spiritual control. But now, the tide is turning. The reawakening of black spirituality is not just an intellectual pursuit. It's a spiritual movement that reconnects us to the power of our ancestors, to the divine within us, and to the earth beneath our feet. By reclaiming our spiritual roots, we find healing, empowerment, and liberation from the spiritual disconnection imposed upon us. As we move forward in this journey of rediscovery, let us remember the truth that history has tried to suppress. The black gods were never lost, they were only silenced. Their wisdom and power are still here, waiting to be embraced, celebrated, and integrated into our lives today. It's time to honor them, to acknowledge their place in our spiritual history, and to reclaim the divine power that belongs to us. If this message resonates with you, I invite you to leave a comment below. What are your thoughts on the erasure of black gods and the spiritual disconnection many face today? How can their forgotten legacies play a role in the modern spiritual world? Let's share our reflections and continue this conversation, because the truth of our shared spirituality is one that needs to be heard. Like, share, and subscribe to continue this journey of rediscovery and spiritual awakening. The path is long, but together we can uncover the divine power that has always been within us.